One of our stall tactics with God is to ask too many questions. And I think something that we can learn from Zechariah, when we hear from God something that we are not expecting or we don't want, is to stop stalling. Like Zechariah, you probably have something that you have heard from God on, and it's not what you wanted to hear. Or like Zechariah, it's just not the way you expected. And when that happens, our tendency is to do just what Zechariah did. We push back. This doesn't make sense to me, God. I don't like it. And it often comes in the form of questions. How's that going to work, God? How can I be sure? What exactly is this supposed to look like? Lots and lots of questions. Here at Crosswinds, we encourage questions. We really mean that. It is okay to question things. It is okay to wrestle with scripture. It's okay to voice your doubt. Some of you here maybe grew up in some kind of a church that said it was not okay to ask questions. Here, it is not only okay, it is encouraged. We believe it is part of our spiritual growth to ask questions, but sometimes, and specifically in an instance like this, questions are not helpful. Some of you know that before we moved here, I was an improviser on the Las Vegas Strip. And if you know anything about improv, it is all about making it up right on the spot. And that's what we did. But there are some rules, and maybe you've heard of some of them. One of them, like a rule of improv, is say yes. Can we all say that together? Say yes. That's right. In improv, you have to say yes to each other because one person is bringing an idea or some information or some context, and as the person with them, you have to receive that. That's what it means to say yes. So, for example, if you've got a scene and somebody walks into the scene and they say to the other person, "Hi, Aunt Julie, I'm so glad I made it to your bedside in time." And then Aunt Julie says, "Yes, we have some important decisions to make." That's a scene that you want to see. That's Aunt Julie saying yes. But if instead the character comes in and says, "Aunt Julie, I'm so glad I made it to your bedside in time," and Aunt Julie says, "What are you talking about? We're at Disneyland." See, that's a no, and that doesn't help the scene at all. So that is the rule of yes. Now, there's other rules, and another one that's maybe not quite as well known is this rule that says, don't ask questions. Let's say that together. Don't ask questions. Okay, the heart behind this one is this. Because you're making it up as you go, every line you say has to move the scene forward. You have to provide some information. But if instead you use your line to ask a question, then not only are you not moving it forward, but you're forcing the other person to have to answer within the context of the question that you're asking. And what happens is the scene slows down, and it doesn't have the momentum that it needs. So, take the same example. Somebody walks in and says, "Aunt Julie, I'm so glad I made it to your bedside in time." And if Aunt Julie says, "What are you doing here?" Well, that doesn't get us anywhere, right? But if the person walks in and says, "Aunt Julie, I'm so glad I made it to your bedside in time," and she says, "Where have you been? I asked you to bring my will 3 days ago." Dun, dun, dun. And then that's what you want to hear. But we're not going to know what happened to Aunt Julie because I made that up. But here is why I bring it up. One of our stall tactics with God is to ask too many questions. And I think something that we can learn from Zechariah, when we hear from God something that we are not expecting or we don't want, is to stop stalling. Asking God too many questions is a great way to stall. And it's tricky because sometimes questions are about discernment and wisdom, and we're trying to seek that, and that's good, and that is true sometimes. But when the litany of questions is simply for you to procrastinate being obedient, that's when you're stalling. And if I could maybe give you a little bit of a litmus test, I would say this. If your questions start with the word how, chances are you're stalling. How could that work? How will I do that? How will I know what to do? Zechariah's question started with a how. How can I be sure of this? If you're stalling by demanding that God show you how, here's the problem with that. He's going to show you how as you do it. And if you get stuck here just asking and wanting all the answers before you move, you may miss ever getting to see God show you how. I want to get back to our narrative in this story of Zechariah, because while the first thing that Zechariah does shows us something not to do, the second thing that happens is something that we should emulate. We left off with the angel telling Zechariah that he was not going to be able to speak until after his son was born, and that's exactly what happens. Immediately, he exits the temple. The fellow priest can tell that something has happened, but he can't communicate it, and he goes into a long season of silence. And during that time, a bunch of things happen. Elizabeth does get pregnant. Elizabeth's relative Mary also gets visited by an angel who tells her she's going to have Jesus. And then Mary goes and visits Elizabeth while both Elizabeth and Mary are pregnant. And this whole time, Zechariah is in like a timeout. He's over in the corner thinking about what he's done. But see, God was doing something in the silence. He was doing something in Zechariah. When Zechariah couldn't speak, what was happening in him was in his heart, in his soul, in his mind. He was coming to terms with what God was asking him to do. In the silence is where he was gaining clarity. And here's how we know that. We fast forward to when John was born. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." And they said to her, "There's no one among your relatives that have that name." And then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. And he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." And immediately his mouth was open, his tongue was set free, and he began to speak, praising God. See, it was so unconventional at that time that you would name your child a name that was not in your family. But remember, the angel said to him, "You are to call him John." And obviously, Zechariah in some way had communicated that to Elizabeth. We are to call him John. And so she speaks up and says, "We're calling him John." And they don't believe her. And then they ask him, and he writes on a tablet, "His name is John." And immediately he can speak again. See, the belief, the acceptance, and the clarity that Zechariah now had was grown in the silence. He went from skepticism to conviction in the silence. When you're hearing something from God that is not what you expected and maybe not what you wanted, giving yourself space to be quiet will bring you a lot of clarity.